Hi, today I'll be reviewing all the contents of AP World History's Unit 7. And basically I'll be doing this because I have a test tomorrow and I thought making a video would help with studying. So let's get started. And also one more thing before we get started, this video is made in honor of Anthony. He's the TA for our class and he's been putting in so much work. And he's probably one of the greatest TAs I ever had. So thank you, Anthony. Keep up the good work, mate. Okay, so let's get started. So 7.1 is basically shifting power. And so the time period for this is between the 1900s to around 1950. So for the whole unit. And so what area we're covering right now is between 1900 and 1910. So the three main revolutions that happened in this time is the Russian, Chinese, and the Mexican. So let's first get started with the Russian Revolution. So in around like the early 20th century, late 19th century, so Russia was basically falling behind most of Europe in a lot of things. There were still, I guess you could say, many of the people were serfs and farmers, while the government was basically partying and being elite, the elite. So the Tsar's government resisted to allow citizens to participate in the government and did not recognize any civil liberties. And these internal problems also led to external problems, such as losing a lot of wars. And so basically with all of this, so the people got angry with their government and they basically they wanted to change their government. So there's this guy named Vladimir Lenin over here, and he basically started a movement called the Bolsheviks, who were like a communist form of society. And so they basically wanted to seize power with the power of the people. And you can see one of those communist party meetings with a lot of, more of a rally, not a meeting. So yeah. So the communists thought the workers that are working under the bourgeoisie, or like the people who pay the workers, or like the owners. And so they thought the workers should own the means of production and that the collective ownership would lead to collective prosperity along with a just society. And so towards that long-term goal, the Soviet government abolished private trade, distributed peasants' crops to feed urban workers, and took over ownership of the country's factories and industries. So this happened after the revolution. And so the Tsar, he abdicated. And so the communist government took power. So the next one we're going to talk about is China. So China basically, by 1911, the Qing dynasty has fallen due to external and internal issues. And that's from the previous unit, Unit 6. So the main internal challenges was basically with multiple ethnic groups, and the largest one was the Han. And the ruler of the Qing dynasty were Manchus from like a region that wasn't in main China, and they were like from the north of China. And so many Chinese did not accept the king as legitimate rulers. So another problem was like a danger of famine. So China had like a lot of population growth between the 1700s and 1800s, but they could not like increase their farmland or the production of their agriculture. And so if like a single incident happened, like, I don't know, a flood or something, all their food would go out and they would be so any natural disaster would have resulted in the deaths of a lot of people. And some external challenges was like basically, as China was one of the most wealthiest states for most of its time, but then it started to stagnate in the 18th century. And so at that time, the Europeans came to China asking to trade, and they started to force trade, and they basically used military force in order to get trade deals, which weakened China internally along with being weakened externally. However, there was one person, Sun Yat-sen, who wanted to create a new republic, but his rule was short and he gave his position to someone else. And so the party that he led was the Chinese Nationalist Party, and I'll be extremely important later on. So the third one we're going to do is the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution was basically when a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, so like that guy, he was a dictator and he basically oversaw a period of stability and a bit of economic progress, but he was considered like a traitor of sorts to the Mexican people by giving like investors from other countries control of many of the resources. And along with that, there was also many of the land in Mexico was given to the rich and the poor barely had enough. So what happened was in 1910, Diaz jailed Francisco Madero, who was the opposition candidate for the president. And so this, along with the numerous amount of other issues, led to a revolution in Mexico called the Mexican Revolution. So Madero escaped from prison and set up revolutionary offices in Texas, and his troops defeated Mexican troops and sending Diaz into exile. So with the end of this, basically what happened was that land was redistributed from the rich to the poor, and there was more land reform. However, there was still a lot of political and social instability and a lot of violence until around the 1920s and 30s. So I guess that's mainly it for 7.1. They're all drawings. So 7.2, causation of World War I. So basically, like the main cause, like the most immediate cause, was due to basically the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip. And this is like a picture of him basically, well, shooting the Archduke. And so basically what happened was that this triggered like a falling of dominoes, which then led to war. Like there's a lot more underlying issues, but in the interest of time, I can't go too in depth into it. And so basically, by the end of the death, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to the Serbian government that it end anti-Austrian agitation along with other requirements. And Serbia basically rejected it, saying, no, we won't do that. And well, war happened. And so after that, Germany declared. So basically, then after that, Austria-Hungary looked for its ally Germany, which was like way much stronger for military assistance. And basically, Serbia asked Russia because of their ties through cultural means. And in the end of it, basically, Germany declared war on Russia, and then on France, and then Britain declared war on Germany, and Austria declared war on Russia, creating like a huge power struggle of war. It's like kind of hard to explain. Like you have to write it out to show it. So I'll just write it out. So basically, it was Russia, Britain, France as like the main powers versus Germany, Austria-Hungary. And later on, once it came, the Ottoman Empire. And so basically this was mainly supposed to be like a European war, but then what happened was that Japan joined, which turned it into a global war, as Japan is in Asia, not Europe. So some long-term causes of this war was due to militarism, which is basically like when you have like your country supporting war in the armed forces, like the military. So like your whole country's society is based on the military. Like it's kind of like it's a little bit like what we have today in the United States with recruiting posters, but it was much more extreme. So, and along with that, like there were alliances, and like basically there was like secret alliances between countries in order to protect their interests. And basically what happened was that like you would call on your ally for extra help if you needed it. And yeah, so 7.3, connecting World War One. So the first thing we got to know is before we get started is that most people thought that World War One would be ended by Christmas. Like, so it started around August. So one popular term is like, well, one popular quote by many soldiers was that everyone said it'll be all over by Christmas. And basically, that's what everyone thought. And it kind of brings up the song by, I'm not sure who it was, like I'll Be Home for Christmas. Yeah. So basically, everyone thought they'll be home by Christmas, and so they were all thinking it'll be a short war, unlike the bloody massacres that are that it became, like the 4-year long war. So basically, what happened next is basically, so the main thing you have to know is how the war was actually fought. So the war, like when it came to actually fighting, so trench warfare was the main form of fighting. So you basically have hundreds, probably even thousands of miles of trenches in like an open field, and they would basically have dugs, like it would have all been dug and yeah, digged. And basically what you would have is you would have hundreds of soldiers fight, just sleeping and eating and doing everything in those trenches for like multiple months at a time. And basically many soldiers died from diseases such as like dysentery and others due to unhygienic conditions. And yeah, so in terms of weapons, so the two main weapons during the war was were machine guns and chemical weapons. So with this picture, you can see like a machine gun mounted on a tripod. And basically what you would have is in the trenches, you would have people going out to fight. So you would have like a whole swath of German troops. So let's say if you have like a whole swath of German troops, yeah. So you would have them rushing out into like a kill zone, and you would have, let's say, British troops or French troops basically mowing down swaths of German troops with a machine gun mounted on a tripod. And so along with this, you also had poison gas. And this is basically like one of those early gas masks that you see. So poison gas basically was like one of the most insidious and frankly disgusting weapons of the war. So basically what poison gas does is that it basically kills you on the inside. So I believe mustard gas, it basically burns out your throat from the inside, and basically you're basically swallowing and eating what's left of your throat. And it's insidious, it's painful, and it's frankly disgusting way of fighting. But then it happened during the war. And so some other smaller aspects like that help with the war, like technology, were submarines and aircraft. So aircraft were mainly used as scout planes, and they weren't used too much. There were air aces in Germany also, and in other countries, and they would engage in dogfights with other enemy aircraft. Submarines have been used briefly in previous wars, but they played a much larger part in World War I, such as U-boats, and they were causing havoc when destroying shipping lanes. And one last thing is tanks. So tanks were also used in some battles, with like them being used to drive over trenches, but that wasn't too much of a major part of the war, but it will be a major part for World War II and everything up to modern day. And the next one is basically the United States enters the war. So there were like two major events that caused US entry into the war. So the first one was basically resentment against the Germans, which was due to U-boat attacks against ships carrying civilians. One major example of this is the Lusitania. And basically a German submarine attacked and sank it. And it was basically carrying more than 100 US citizens among its passengers. However, this wasn't even the biggest reason why. The event that actually caused the United States to go in was due to the Zimmermann telegram in 1917. So basically this telegram was the German government wanting to offer Mexico like to help them regain territory if they joined Germany during the war. But then British intelligence captured that telegram and sent it to the United States, which made the Americans angry, and we went to the war. And so the other major principle of this war is total war. So total war basically has everyone like in the public and soldiers fighting to helping with the war effort. So this is like a recruiting poster for the US Army during the war, basically having Uncle Sam uh, asking you to join a recruiting station. So propaganda is basically communication meant to influence the attitudes and opinions of a community around a particular subject. And so basically it was used in many valid and extremely good forms in order to get more people to support the war effort. So I'll clear the drawings. So let's go on to 7.4. Okay. So 7.4 is basically with the end of the war, the Paris Peace Conference happened. And basically that was with the United States, England, France, and Italy. So they all worked to set final agreements against the losers, or Germany and the Ottoman Empire and other countries. So basically what happened was that Germany lost some territory, and they also basically were forced to pay for almost all the money with the almost all the money with the war. And so this caused like hyperinflation due to people not being able to pay for the bills and causing starvation. And this is a picture of Germany in the 1920s with many people waiting for breadlines. And along with that, you would have the Great Depression, which is basically when the United States it had some issues with the stock market, which resulted in a crash in 1929, and that also caused food lines. And this is, I believe, in Chicago. I'm not fully sure, but you have a lot of citizens working to get some food for the unemployed. And so basically after the war, like the whole reason for this after the war for the Allies is because during the war, you would have many people supplying so much crops during the war. However, at the end of the war, people didn't need as much crops. So you didn't need as much stuff. So when farmers still had the same amount of stuff, like let's say wheat, they had the same amount of wheat as they did pre-war, but people don't need it. They have so much extra. So they could sell it so they're forced to sell it out at a lower price. And so with it becoming cheaper and cheaper and not people needing enough, it basically caused inflation on prices and basically made it so that they couldn't earn enough money to pay for any debts. So along with that, you basically had political revolutions that, like we talked about, in the 1910s. And so those also happened, such as in Russia. So basically in Russia, you had another civil war where people revolted against the Russian government's actions. And basically, as the Russian economy was under collapse, his new economic plan was used to reintroduce private trade. But it did enjoy some success. But when Lenin died, Joseph Stalin became leader, and he stopped it. So yeah, and another thing is with the rise of right-wing governments. So basically during then, with Germany and other countries such as Italy being short-fronted by, I'm not sure what's the word, being slighted by the other allies, and after the end of the war, fascism started to rise. And basically it's like a form of extreme nationalism, which also glorified the military and armed struggle and blamed problems on ethnic minorities. And so two of the major people that you need to know for this is Benito Mussolini, who basically coined the term of fascism. And basically he created the first fascist government in Italy. And then you have Hitler coming up in the 1930s. So let's do 7.5. So 7.5 was basically like what was going on after the war, not just economically, but around the entire world. So the first thing you got to know is after the war, many of like the allies that were the most victorious, such as the United States, England, and France, they basically like didn't want to allow the others, like such as Italy and Japan and other colonies, to get like their fair share of stuff, like their fair share of colonies and spoils of war. So basically, after World War One, European powers basically granted self-determination only to white countries in Eastern Europe. They did not let their colonies go and self-govern themselves because they basically said that the colonies needed help with uh, and tutelage from more advanced nations in order to survive. So the Allied countries basically increased their imperial holdings while giving, frankly, a stupid excuse. I would say something worse, but it's not like school appropriate. So yeah, so what you would have is this map of England and former territories, and basically this became mostly British, French, and Italian over at the end of the war. Along with this, you would have anti-colonialist protests in places such as Africa and South Asia, and this is the Salt March of Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. And so let's go to India for a bit. So India, basically, the Indian National Congress was formed in the late 19th century to air grievances against the colonial government. And by the end of the war, it had become like a strong voice for independence. And due to a massacre at Armistar, it basically radicalized many Indians and convinced people to ask for independence against Britain as the only way to move forward for India as a country. And basically, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi, he basically brought the Congress's cause to the masses of India, and he caught the attention of the world by basically creating protests in order to show the world the British injustice, the system. And the next thing we have to go into is basically nationalism in East China. So with East China, so what you would have is that you have two parties, the KMT, or the Nationalist Party, and the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. And the Nationalist Party was led by Chiang Kai-shek. And so what happened was that basically you would have the Chinese and the Chinese the CCP and the Chinese National Party. They both went to war against each other and led to a civil war. And so this pictures of this propaganda post is of the the Long March. So basically, after a loss of the CCP, they had to retreat in order to inland China in order to train and just regroup and get some R&R. And so basically they had 80,000 troops at the beginning, and when they finally got to inland China, there was only 10,000 people. And while all this happening, Japan is starting to invade parts of Manchuria along with China, and this all comes to a head by the late 1930s. So 7.6, causes of World War II. So there's mainly two areas that we have to focus on for this. So the first one we're going to talk about is Germany. So Germany, you have like a young Adolf Hitler who basically is promoting Nazism in Germany. And so he wanted, so his group, the National Socialist Government of Germany, or not the Nazis, they basically took over all of Germany through some underhanded means. And this is like the stormtroopers. They were basically political violence against other parties, such as like the communists and Jews, and yeah. And he was basically trying, so he had like the Jewish people and the other ethnic minorities as scapegoats for Germany's problems, claiming that they that they were traitors, and there needed to be a pure German nation of Aryans that were purged of outsiders. And so basically it all came up to a head with the Nuremberg laws, which started the whole thing and forbade marriage between Jews and people who are not Jewish, and stripped Jews of their citizenship, and a lot of other, frankly, horrifying stuff. And after this, basically, you have the Night of Long Knives, and actually, wait, it's Night of Broken Glass, my bad. So basically, that produced anti-Jewish riots that occurred in response to the assassination of a German diplomat. And basically, the entire opposition was engineered by the Nazi leaders, and it led to many deaths of German Jews and destruction of so much Jewish shops. And many Jews were dragged out of their homes and sent to concentration camps. And they were finally, although this didn't occur to any Jewish citizens of Germany after the war, during the war, they were given an opportunity to leave the country. And next thing we have to do is basically Japan. So Japan started expanding and doing aggressive actions against China and Korea. And they basically started taking control of spots in China. And basically they managed to steamroll over most of it. So, and yeah, so now let's do, wait one sec. It's kind of getting harder and harder to talk. So 7.7, conducting World War II. So let's first get started with Germany over here. So in September 1st, 1939, Germany basically invaded Poland, and Hitler, his army used the strategy called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, to subdue Poland. They managed to take over the whole country in pretty much a single month. And by the end of the year, they managed to Germany, along with the Soviet Union, split the country of Poland into two sections as a part of their non-aggression pact. And after that, it was basically a phony war of sorts. Like, most people didn't do much until the invasion of France in spring of 1940. And this was done, and I'm gonna gloss over it a bit, but it was basically done in order to get to England, as England was basically their main opponent at this time. So after the fall of France, England was the main opponent, so you had the Battle of Britain. So in Europe, by July 1940, Hitler ordered that like a large aerial campaign was to be against England by the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force. So he wanted the entirety of Britain to be bombarded and, well, taken out before a land and sea invasion could happen. And so basically they sent swaths of bombers against British aircraft. And this picture is of a flight of British Hawker Hurricanes, which were some of the main fighters during the war. This and the Supermarine Spitfire were instrumental in winning the Battle of Britain for England. So by the end of the battle, the Luftwaffe lost almost 1,000 or more planes, while the British were still able to keep fighting. So the operation ended in a failure. And after this, he started Operation Barbarossa, and that was basically against the Soviet Union in order to eliminate Bolshevism and to create a Lebensraum, or land for settlement and development for the German people. And basically what happened was that he basically invaded Russia, and I'm going to show Google Maps. One second. They're all drawings. Picture. Okay. So I'm going to show Google Maps over here, and so he basically invaded. So from Poland, he went on to Russia, all the way up to Moscow and places like that. And what he did is that he managed to get almost to the gates of Moscow, but then by then it became winter, and the Russians got their crack troops from Serbia and other places in order to fight back. And the thing is, Russian winter is an extremely overpowered weapon if you are a Russian. So so the Russians were pushed back and back and back all the way up to places such as Leningrad and Kursk. And Kursk was basically the final battle of, like, the final defeat of the German army. So this small town. So they wanted to do a final offensive to take over this area, but they managed to fail in one of the largest and probably most bloodiest tank battles in world history. And now let's go on to the Japanese side of things. So oh yeah, I need to show Google Maps again. So in April 19, so Japan basically at this time, they wanted to take over parts of the Philippines and other areas. So they basically took over Korea, and then they went into China through Manchuria, and I believe this is Manchuria. And they took over many parts of mainland China. And with this, they managed to take over, along with this, they took over places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, and some other places. So they basically had like a sphere of influence of sorts to protect against an American invasion. So something like this, yeah. So now what they did is that in around 1941, they prepared for an attack against the Americans because the US Navy was the main force against them. So they decided to take out Hawaii, like a US naval base known as Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii, in order to take out their main weapons. So basically what you would have is the harbor, it had almost all the American aircraft, well, not aircraft, they had their battleships and fuel supplies. So they managed to destroy almost all the battleships and many of the Navy, but they did not take out the fuel supplies, and they did not manage to take out the aircraft carriers because the aircraft carriers were gone. And this, frankly, could probably consider their thing as a failure, as the aircraft carriers were instrumental in the war, as they basically allowed you to project air power. And I'll be back to slideshow. Okay, so with this, so during the war, so basically, so the tide turned for Japan in 1942 in the Battle of Midway. So during that battle, like, I'm going to just basically go over it very quickly, but the Americans basically curb stomped the Japanese by the end, and they destroyed basically most of their carrier fleet, and they pretty much won. So with this, Japan pretty much did not have much of a chance of victory. And in Europe, after the Battle of Kursk, the Soviet Union started pushing back against Germany and started invading even more, invading against like former German territories. And this is a T-34 tank in, I believe, Kursk. Yeah, Battle of Kursk, T-34. And along with this, so now with America, they want to also start to invade Germany through, well, let's say they want to invade Germany, and they decide to do it in a joint operation with the British, which is now known as D-Day or Operation Overlord. So this is probably like a whole video in and of itself, like all of this World War II stuff. Like, I'm just going over it as quick as I can. So the US and British, they decide to take over, so they decide to take over Normandy as a staging point for starting the war. And 1 second, I'll just pull up Normandy. And, well, if I can find it, that'd be great. That's weird. Oh well, so just pretend this is Normandy. So the the US and British decided to take over Normandy through 5 ways. Basically, the US had 2 landing zones, the British had 2 landing zones, and Canada had 2 landing zones. And by the end of the Battle of Normandy or D-Day, the US gained a beachhead and they managed to push forward in order to get to Paris. And then they moved on to take over to basically liberate the rest of France, and then Belgium, Netherlands, and going all the way to Western Germany. And so and on the Pacific side of the war, you basically had an island hopping campaign by the United States, where basically you would have a whole group of US Marines supported by a carrier task force, basically fighting for every inch of that island, and just taking over some of the least important ones. And they managed to do this until they got to Okinawa, which is, wait, no, that's wrong island. Yeah. So once they managed to get to these islands, they managed to get to Okinawa, and that was mainly the final battle of World War II with and so the US estimated that there will be around like 10,000 casualties by the end of the war, and they didn't want to risk it, so they decided to drop 2 atomic weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And this caused the Japanese to effectively end the war, and it led to Japanese surrender. So back to the German side of things. So what you had is, so you had both the Americans and the Russians pushing on both sides to get to Germany, and the Russians basically reached Berlin first. And this picture is of the Reichstag being put under a Soviet flag. And so the Russians got to Berlin, and that caused the end of the war with surrender. So along with conducting World War II, in order to get all those equipment and all those systems ready to go and done, such as weapons, like everything from the big bombers all the way to boots and just food for the people, they had propaganda in order to get people to join the war, join and help support the war effort. One of the most popular ones, and probably the most known, is Rosie the Riveter, as shown here. And basically, it was used to great effect in order to get people to join the war. And along with this, there was also, this one's a Royal Air Force recruitment ad, well, a recruitment poster. So, yeah, so propaganda was used in great effort to get the public to support and the war, and it was pretty effective. So with the end of World War II, you would have around 75 million people, and 2/3 of that were civilians dead. And around like 1/3 of that 75 million was the Soviet Union, which kind of, like it's like 25 million just for a single country. It's wow. Yeah. So 7.8, the last unit. So we're almost done. So this is basically mass atrocities during from 1900 to the present day. So basically, so the first pictures of the Rwandan genocide, so that was caused by like, it's kind of a bit hard to explain. So when people were treating so it started with the Belgian colonizers who had treated the minority Tutsis better than the majority Hutus. So the latter group, the Hutus, they did not like the Tutsis for all the power that they enjoyed. And when Rwanda won its independence from Belgium, the Hutu majority won control of the government, and they took revenge of the Tutsis by discriminating against them. And basically, it came to a boil in 1993 when Rwanda's president was killed in an airplane crash shot down by rebel forces. But this lit like the flames of genocide, and almost 500,000 to 1 million civilians were killed. So And with this one, the international response basically was insufficient to call this. So UN peacekeepers were not authorized to use force to restore order, and there were barely any peacekeepers to support and protect the Rwandans. So individual countries such as the United States just evacuated their personnel from the country, and they just stayed away from the whole thing. So yeah. And this one, probably the most known genocide, is the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was basically caused by the Germans and due to against the Jewish people, along with other ethnic groups such as Slavs um, and people with mental disorders. So they basically put people into different concentration camps where the people who are fit and were allowed to, well, not allowed to, they were forced to work in labor camps, while the weak and people who couldn't do much, they were basically killed off. And the last one, the one that not much people know of because most governments do not want to talk about it, hint, hint, Turkey and the United States, the Armenian genocide. So the Armenian genocide was caused in 1915 with the introduction of World War One. So basically the Armenian, well, sorry, not the Armenian, the Ottoman government, they decided to scapegoat the Armenian people and put them into concentration camps of sorts. Well, not concentration camps, into concentration camps in order to get them to, and they basically put them into starving marches, and they would walk across the desert in order to just kill as much people as possible. And this picture is of, I believe, a woman, like, or a man and her daughter and his daughter, grieving for the child's mother and the husband's wife. So frankly, it's saddening. So with the genocide, you had almost 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians dead in Turkey, and this was like the first genocide of the 20th century. And so this genocide occurred from 1915 to 1917, and basically and still to this day, the Turkish government denies the claim that the Armenian genocide was in fact a genocide. They claim that the deaths were the result of war actions, ethnic conflicts, and disease. And many foreign governments also agree with that claim, even if they privately may agree the opposite due to being allies with Turkey. So I guess that's it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it helped in any way, shape, or form. And I guess that's all I have. So this was a pretty long one. So I guess I'll stop now. So thank you and have a good rest of the day and stay safe.